Pilgrimage. Tales of the Magi Saga by Andrew Dobell. Chapter 1. The taxi bounced along the dirt road through the small town. There were very few tarmac roads in this part of Romania, and most of the locals were using horse and cart rather than cars. There were times when Chris found it amazing that there were still parts of the world that had not really caught up with the modern digital world of the West, with its super-fast broadband internet and modern luxuries. But it was also kind of reassuring and quaint that places like this were still somewhat untouched by progress. They weren't entirely untouched, though, as he noticed another local speaking on a mobile phone. They were everywhere these days. The old taxi bumped through another pothole as Chris spotted the pub up ahead, where he was due to meet with Theodore. He got a sinking feeling in his stomach as he wondered what he was getting himself into. It was the same paralyzing fear he had felt in the Himalayas about 1.5 years ago. Now he found himself just staring at the building. "Hey, hello?" the driver called to him, breaking the daydream suddenly and snapping him back to reality and the realization that the car had stopped. The man said something to him in the local language, but Chris wasn't sure what the man had said. He had his hand held out, though, and suddenly the gist of the words were clear. He wanted paying. Chris pulled out some money, passed it to the driver, and extracted himself from the car, pulling all his gear with him. The driver waved goodbye to him and pulled away, continuing to bounce along through the potholes and dodge the horse-drawn carts as he went. The street wasn't busy, not like a London street, but there were still people going about their business, many of them looking over at the strange-looking foreigner who had just appeared in their village. Further along, some kids played a game, running here and there, while a couple of older men sat smoking their pipes. Their conversation paused for the time being as they eyed Chris with curiosity. Well, he thought, no time like the present. So he swung his bag onto his shoulder and made his way over the street towards the pub, dodging a pile of stinking horse manure as he went. He stopped just outside the door and looked around, noticing all the faces pointed his way, their eyes filled with curiosity about this new stranger. Above the buildings on the opposite side of the street, the tall Romanian mountains towered high into the sky, partially veiled in mist and low-hanging clouds, giving them a mysterious and creepy feel. He wondered if, in the next few days, he would come face to face with the terrors he'd met once before on the slopes of the Tibetan mountains. The thought chilled him to the bone, but he also knew it was something he had to do. He had to prove something to himself once and for all. Chris sighed. This would be an eventful few days, of that he had no doubt. He turned, opened the door to the bar, and stepped inside. The room beyond was only dimly lit, both by the hazy light that streamed in through the dirty windows and the old electrical light bulbs that were placed haphazardly around the room. There were a few tables on either side of him, and a few small alcoves as well. He felt like he was in some kind of western when the hero walks into the saloon and everything stops as the locals turn to look at the new arrival. It probably wasn't quite as bad as that, but many of the people who were getting a drink in here did stop what they were doing and look at the newcomer. Chris smiled nervously and started to look around, wondering if Theodore would be here by now. "Chris?" said a voice to his left. He turned to see a middle-aged man with greying hair that was combed harshly back from his face. He wore silver-rimmed glasses with circular lenses and sported a neat, if slightly flamboyant, moustache and goatee beard that complemented his tweed jacket and dark trousers. But his smile and the look in his eyes was bright and welcoming, just as he'd remembered them from their last meeting back in London. "Theodore, you beat me here. It's great to see you," Chris said. "It is a pleasure for me too," Theodore answered in his Romanian accented English. "It has been too long, my friend. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your help with this," he said. "Not a problem. You were there for me when I needed someone to believe me, and for me to talk to. I feel I owe you for that, And anyway, I think I need to do this for myself as well, too. To confront your demons. Something like that, yes. Chris smiled. The smile was not one of happiness, though. Rather, it was an indication that Theodore had hit upon some kind of truth, and he was admitting it to himself as much as to Theodore. This is good. Come, sit with me and meet my new friend, Theodore said. Friend? Chris asked, and looked behind Theodore to the table he'd been sitting at, and noticed a young woman there, looking at them and waiting patiently. Yes, here, this is Caitlin Atwood. She will be joining us on this trip, he said, gesturing to the woman sat at the table. She smiled and stood to greet him, offering her hand to Chris with a radiant smile that lit up the room. Chris gladly took her hand in greeting. Christopher Riley, explorer and adventurer extraordinaire, it's a pleasure to meet you, she said in her American accented voice that sounded sweet and perfect to Chris. Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do enjoy a good climb up a mountain, he said. Don't be so modest. I've been aware of your work for a while now. Hard not to be with all those television appearances, she smiled back. Ah, well, it's been a while since I did one of those, he said. I know. I saw the news reports about that incident in the Himalayas, the investigation into the deaths of your teammates. That can't have been easy, she said. Chris's smile faded as the memories flooded back. The sheer terror he'd felt up there in the ice and snow, seeing his team get torn apart right before his very eyes only for that thing to spare him. Why don't we sit down and get you a drink? Theodore said and signaled the barman. Sure, thanks, Chris answered as he sat in one of the empty chairs at the table. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you, Caitlin said. It's fine, I'm okay, he answered her. I've had to deal with much worse these past few months. At least it seems to have calmed down now, he said. Well, we're grateful to have you with us. Your expertise will be needed on this expedition, she said. The bartender delivered another ale to the table, which Chris took a sip from. It wasn't the best beer in the world, but he was grateful for it anyway. So, are you going to tell me more about what we're going to be hunting for then, Theodore? Chris asked. As far as Chris knew, Theodore had found a lead on a long-forgotten mystical place in the mountains of Romania, and he needed Chris's help to find it. Trekking into the mountains was a dangerous business, and they needed someone who knew what they were doing. But of course, now that we're all here, I don't see why not, Theodore said from where he sat on Chris's left. There is a place, a cave, I suppose, that legends say used to be the home of a witch, a powerful and terrible woman who terrorized this region hundreds of years ago with her magic. This cave has been spoken of for hundreds of years, but few have actually found it. Less still have lived to tell the tale. At least, that's what the legends say. And what do you say? Chris asked. I think it's real, and we both know that there truly are things that defy explanation. The myths and embellishments, well, that's typical local superstition, but I think there is something there. Even today, that place is avoided by the locals and, of the few who venture there, some never return, he said. You've known about this place for a while now? Indeed I have, and I have attempted to find it before as well, but with no luck. It's been one of those little side projects that I return to from time to time. But when Caitlin here came to me with what she knew, I figured a return trip would be needed, Theodore answered him. I believe I can find the cave, Caitlin said from Chris's right. Chris turned to her on his right. She was a creature of rare beauty and had a bookish look to her. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back from her face, where a pair of dark-rimmed glasses perched on her thin nose. Her dark eyes were captivating and seemed to bore deep into his soul. She wore a shirt beneath a woolen sleeveless top and a tweed skirt that hugged her hips where she sat. He couldn't help it. He found himself incredibly attracted to this woman, and she'd barely said 3 sentences to him. It had been a while since he'd last been with a woman after his marriage had broken down following the incident. He'd found it difficult to meet someone new. The stigma of the investigation into what had happened, and with him being the prime suspect, had never left him. "You know where it is?" Chris asked. "I believe so," she said. "So, where is it?" "In those mountains," she said. "Can you be more specific?" Chris asked. "Now that we're all here, sure," she said. "You haven't shared this with Theodore yet?" "Not fully, but I was just protecting myself. I didn't want him going up there without me," she said. "But you're happy to share the details now? Because if you don't, I walk," he threatened her. He wanted to know what he was getting into. She looked up at him then, clearly weighing him up and assessing him. "Yes, I'm happy," she said. "Okay, but before you do that, what exactly is it we're looking for here? Theodore said something about a cave that used to be a witch's home?" he said. The idea of them going to find a witch felt strange. It felt like going to find Santa's house. The idea was just slightly ridiculous. Caitlin smiled. "They're called the Wailing Tunnels. It's a cave system high up in the mountains where, as legend has it, a witch once lived, back when people believed in these things. She used to rule these lands, held the locals in the grip of fear, and demanded sacrifices from them. Rumors say that the locals used to give her gold and riches, and that it's all still up there for the taking. People have tried to find it for years, heading up into the mountains seeking their fortune. Most return empty-handed, having found nothing, but a handful return having gone mad, saying they saw things, terrible things, and then a few, maybe one every year or two, never come back." "So it is a witch's home?" Chris asked. "That's right. Her name was Jasmine, I believe," Caitlin said. "Are you serious? You mean you believe this?" Chris asked. "And you don't? The man who was attacked by the abominable snowman?" Caitlin challenged him. "That was different," he countered. "Oh, really? Please enlighten me," she said. Chris opened his mouth, ready to argue his case, but he came up short. No, his story was as crazy as hers sounded. He couldn't argue with her. She was right. "Okay, you win," he conceded. "A witch it is. Now tell me how we find these Wailing Tunnels," he asked. Caitlin smiled, clearly pleased with herself after winning that little disagreement. He found he didn't mind. He wasn't sure he believed in witches yet, but he'd go along with it and see what they found up there. He knew what he'd seen in those mountains a year and a half ago, something that he could only refer to as some kind of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and it had killed his entire team, but spared him and left him with a warning to stay away. The thing had actually spoken to him, and that was the craziest thing of all. Of course, he was dragged through the press. People thought the altitude had got to him, and he was the one who had gone mad and killed his team. In the end, he'd been acquitted due to lack of evidence. But his career was effectively over. He was lucky. He had savings built up from years of sponsorship and television deals. He wouldn't be struggling for a long time yet, if ever. Chris listened as Caitlin went over the details of the expedition as best she knew them. The directions she had were kind of vague and concerned landmarks more than anything else. He hoped he'd be able to make sense of them on the path up the mountain. As he listened, he found himself fascinated by her. She was certainly attractive, and there was something about her that just reeled him in. He felt sure that beneath that straight-laced exterior there was a wildcat. Once or twice he found himself daydreaming about her and had to shake his head to snap out of it and focus on the task at hand. She wouldn't be interested in him. She was clearly a woman of refined tastes, and a scruffy, washed-up climber would surely not register on her radar. Eventually, The night drew on as they finalized their plans. "And we have a guide meeting us tomorrow, right?" Theodore asked. "That's right. I arranged one before coming out here. He'll meet us at the edge of town," Chris said. "Does he know where we're going?" "No, he doesn't. He thinks we're going for a scenic hike, and that's all," Chris said. "Probably best not to mention our true goal to him, then. It might spook him," Theodore explained. Agreed. They can be a superstitious lot, these guides. The rest of the evening was spent in more friendly conversation over drinks and a meal before Theodore suggested they all get an early night. Chris agreed, although he felt it was a little too early for him. Still, Caitlin seemed keen on retiring, so he figured it was best to follow suit. He'd already booked his room a little earlier that evening, and they were all staying in the guest rooms above the bar. The room was small with peeling plaster, paint that was cracked and worn away in places, but it still looked like one of the better rooms in the village. There wasn't much to his room, just a bed and a desk with a chair and one small window. They would be sharing a bathroom, apparently. Chris had stripped down to his underwear and was laying on his bed, wondering just what he had gotten himself into this time. Witches and caves and people going missing. Is that what his life had become? Well, at least he would be getting paid for this. Theodore had funded his trip over here and had promised a bonus on safe return. That was something, at least. Chris barely noticed the light knock on his door and for a moment thought he was imagining things. But when he heard it again, he jumped up from the bed and walked over to the door. "Hello?" he said, just loud enough for the person on the other side of the door to hear him. "Hey, it's only me," he heard Caitlin say. "Oh, shit," he whispered to himself. "One moment," he said louder for her to hear, and opened the door after unlocking it. Caitlin stood there in a silk dressing gown, wearing a pair of fluffy-looking socks and a smile. "Hi," she said. He noticed her quick glance down as she looked him over, and he suddenly realized he was only wearing his boxer shorts. "Oh, come in?" he asked. "Let me put something on." "Don't bother on my account," she said. He'd stepped away into the room, heading for his pile of clothes to grab a t-shirt, but stopped and looked back at her. "Sorry?" he said. She closed the door behind her and turned the key. The click of the lock slamming home suddenly taking on an arousing aspect that he'd never have associated with it before. She turned, pulled on the silk tie around her waist, and let the robe fall open before slipping it off her shoulders. "Oh," Chris said, briefly dumbstruck. "Sorry, but, are you all right?" he asked, not wanting to believe that this was actually happening. "Chris, don't play coy with me now. Do you think I'm blind?" she whispered, taking a step towards him, wearing only her fluffy pink socks. "I noticed you looking at me. I could see that you were interested, don't deny it." "Ah, well, yes, I suppose I was." "Was?" she asked, stepping up to him, placing the fingers of her right hand on his chest ever so lightly. "Well, that is, he stammered. "Yes, okay, I am." What?" All he could do was stand there, unsure if all this was real or not. He'd only met this girl a few hours earlier. This was insane. What on earth was going on? I'm attracted to you," he admitted. "That's better. We got there in the end," she purred, and kissed him. Chapter 2. Chris woke up to the memories of the previous night and smiled. Caitlin had been incredible, and as he had suspected, beneath that prim and proper exterior there was indeed a wildcat hidden just beneath the surface. She was amazing. He remembered how, in the afterglow, she had teased him about not leaving her alone in a cold tent up on the mountain before leaving him for the night and returning to her room. Chris got out of bed, had a shower in the joint bathroom, and headed down for some breakfast, which consisted of some bread, cheese, some cold meats, and a rather hearty broth that he kind of liked. Theodore was the first to put in an appearance, smiling at Chris as he sat next to him and looking like an excited school kid about to visit the chocolate factory. "Sleep well?" Theodore asked. "Very well, thank you," answered Chris. "And you?" "Terribly. I'm just too excited about what we might find up there. I've been hoping to return to this place for years, and now I'm finally going to do it. I had kind of resigned myself to never finding it and passing on my research to someone else. You, perhaps. But to think we might actually be able to find the tunnels. I'm just thrilled and thankful I'm still fit enough to make the trip." Chris smiled. This seemed to be a dream come true for Theodore, something he'd worked towards for years. He just hoped that it would live up to the old man's expectations. A short time later, Caitlin appeared, dressed in her hiking gear like Chris and Theodore, and, still, she managed to look stunning to Chris's eyes. She smiled at him and winked. Chris felt the colour burn in his cheeks and hoped his embarrassment wasn't too obvious to Theodore. He wasn't sure what he might think of him sleeping with Caitlin, so their little fling would be kept a secret for now. Caitlin joined them and tucked into the food on the table. "How did you sleep?" Theodore asked her. "Oh, I tossed and turned a bit, but slept rather well in the end," she said brightly. Chris smiled. He felt sure she was teasing him. "That's good. Let's finish up here. I'm keen to get up there and see what we can find," Theodore said, finishing off another chunk of bread. Half an hour later, they were walking out to the edge of town, and waiting just where he said he would be was their guide. He was a thin, wiry-looking man, with long hair tied back and patchy stubble around his jaw. Chris thought he looked malnourished, but he greeted them with a firm handshake that felt surprisingly strong. "Hello, hello. I am Augustine Petran, your guide. Welcome to Romania. How are you today?" he asked with a heavily accented voice. "We're good, thanks," Chris said, before Theodore said something in Romanian. The two natives of the area then spoke for a minute in the local language. Chris had no idea what they were talking about, but there was some pointing up the nearby track and into the foothills above them. Augustine seemed concerned about something, but Theodore reassured him, and the talk finished with smiles, and everyone sounding very happy. Theodore winked at Chris without Augustine seeing before they started to make their way up the track and away from the road they had been stood on. With the guide up ahead, Theodore moved in next to Chris as they walked. "Everything okay?" Chris asked. He looked a little concerned about something. "Just some of the usual superstitions. He was worried that we would be looking for the witch, but of course I assured him that this was not our goal at all." "And he was satisfied with that?" Chris asked. "Seemed to be. We'll see, I suppose." "Do we know where we're going? Caitlin has the directions, right?" "We'll be following her lead, yes," Theodore said. As Chris watched, Caitlin had already moved up to speak with Augustine and seemed to be discussing things with him, pointing to a map she had out and some of the landscape up ahead. "I hope she doesn't spook the guide," Chris said. "I doubt it. She can be quite persuasive when she wants to be," Theodore said. "Have you known her long?" Chris asked. "A few months. I met her at a talk on the metaphysical. We sat next to each other during one of the sessions, and we ended up meeting afterwards and just got along quite well. We had similar interests, and she talked to me about some of her lines of research, one of them being the Wailing Tunnels. She felt she was close to a breakthrough on its location, and, sure enough, a little over a month later, she got back in touch, saying she was certain of where the tunnels were and needed a mountaineer that would be able to help her find them. Luckily, I knew you." "Yeah, that is lucky," Chris said. But something about that story didn't sit right with him. It was too convenient, too easy. Maybe Theodore was lying. Maybe he wasn't giving Chris the full story for some reason, or maybe there was more to Caitlin's motivations than she was letting on. He wasn't sure. Of course, With everything that had happened in his life recently, it was entirely possible that he just saw conspiracy and ulterior motives where there was none. He'd had to deal with media intrusions into his private life, journalists trying to get close to him, ingratiate themselves to him to try and get the real story, and then printing lies and half-truths in the national papers. Needless to say, Chris's trust in the goodness and kindness of strangers was at an all-time low. So, maybe he was just seeing a conspiracy where there was none. Chris shook his head and tried to forget about it. He needed to concentrate on the trek and the world around him. They were heading into a dangerous environment, and they would need his expertise more and more the higher they got. So, best not to start thinking that any of the people on this trek wasn't as trustworthy as they appeared to be, unless anyone's actions started to jeopardize the safety of the group, of course. Caitlin slowed and let Chris and Theodore catch up to her while the guide continued on ahead. "Do we know where we're going?" Chris asked. "Of course. We have a series of landmarks to follow, so I was just relaying them to Augustin so he knows where we're going. He seems happy with it all," she said with a smile. The group continued up the slope, moving into the foothills of the mountain range before them. They had left the village far behind now, and it looked very small where it sat far below them. The going was not too difficult, a steady incline with a few rocks and undulations, but they weren't really climbing yet. Rather, it felt like they were just walking up an endless hill. As they continued on, the path grew more indistinct and soon faded away altogether, leaving them walking over grass and rocks, heading south up the side of the mountain. As they crested their second hill well into the afternoon, Chris spotted a very wild-looking forest up ahead. "Is that where we're going?" Chris asked Caitlin, who stood nearby. "Into the forest, yes. We need to walk through it and come out the other side," she said. The forest looked huge and spread up the side of the mountain before it stopped and the rocky mountain terrain took over. "Okay, if you're sure," he said. He wasn't too worried either way, forest or not. The benefit of the forest was that it would protect them from any poor weather that might come their way. There would also probably be some wildlife and other resources they could use if needed. The group continued on as the guide led them along what he believed to be the best route. The forest grew closer. As they got within a few hundred feet of the edge of the tree line, it was clear that there was something like a marker or a sign about 50 yards out from the wood. Curiosity drew them closer to it, and they soon found themselves walking up towards this strange little monument. "What is that?" Chris asked. "I have no idea," Theodore said, as they both peered at it in the distance. The guide led them, but he stopped about 20 meters from the marker before turning to the group. "No, I go no further," he said. "This is cursed land. This is wrong. Dangerous. No further. We go back now, okay? We go back." He started to walk back the way he came, but Caitlin got in his way. Chris and Theodore walked closer to the effigy, determined to get a better look at it while Caitlin stayed with the guide and talked to him. They could make it out much clearer now, and it was obvious why the guide had freaked out. It was a simple and crude marker made of a thick stake in the ground, topped with a human skull, bleached white. On the front of the stake, a dead black bird, a crow maybe, had been nailed to it by a single crude metal spike, blood still leaking out from the wound, glistening in the afternoon light as it seeped from the corpse. Chapter 3. "Well, that's gross," Chris said. "What do you make of it?" "I think we're on the right track. That's what I think," Theodore said. "You don't think this is a local trying to freak us out?" "Maybe, but maybe there's more to the stories of the Wailing Tunnels than I had ever dared hope for," Theodore said. Chris looked at him. "You mean the witch?" he said, unsure whether he was serious or not. "Or whatever it is up there," Theodore said, looking past the effigy and into the woods and the mountains beyond. Chris wasn't quite sure what to think. This curious marker certainly did creep him out a bit, though. Who the hell nails a live bird to a wooden pole anyway, and then leaves it out for other people to find? It was messed up, and although he might not be freaking out like the guide was, he certainly didn't like it either. Chris looked back at the guide. He was now standing quietly and staring into the middle distance, clearly not wanting to look at the gory effigy as Caitlin spoke to him. Chris wandered over towards her, wondering if the guide would indeed be heading back to town. But Caitlin apparently finished what she was saying, left the guide where he was, and walked to meet Chris part way. The guide looked up at her and watched her walk away. He looked shaken, but much calmer now. "Everything okay?" "He looked a little freaked out before," Chris said. "I think so. We just had a little talk. I did my best to reassure him that everything was okay. I think I got through to him," she said. Chris looked over her shoulder at the guide, who was still watching them. "Well, I hope so," he said. "Let's find out, shall we? How about we keep going a little longer, get into the woods before we set up camp?" Caitlin asked. "Sounds good. You bring him, I'll get Theodore," Chris said. Caitlin nodded and walked back to the guide. Chris watched her go for a moment before he turned and moved over towards Theodore. "We're heading into the forest," Chris informed Theodore, who was still looking at the effigy and scratching away in his notebook. "Oh, good. Is the guide coming with us?" he asked. Chris looked over his shoulder and saw Caitlin walking the guide forward, taking a wide berth around the effigy. "Looks that way," he said. "Good. Let's not waste any more time then," the older man said, slipping his notebook into his pocket and swinging his pack onto his back again. Leaving the grotesque effigy behind, they made their way into the woods, and as they moved further away from the tree line, the guide seemed to grow in confidence. Soon, he was leading them forward, guiding them over the rough terrain and doing what they were paying him to do again. As night drew in, they found a somewhat clearer area of ground and decided to set up camp for the night. Once the tents were up and the fire started, they boiled up some water, and before long they were enjoying a nice hot drink while the guide cooked them up a feast from the various bits of food they had brought with them. Sitting on the opposite side from the guide as he prepared their food, Chris smiled as Caitlin came and sat next to him, her fingers wrapped around the hot mug of tea. "He seems to have perked up a bit," Chris said, indicating the guide, who was too busy to notice they were talking about him. "Yeah, it's just silly superstition, really. Once he was past it, I think he realized there wasn't much to it, really. It's just some local trying to scare people with their sick jokes." "Is that what you think it is?" Caitlin looked at him. She seemed to be weighing up the answer before she voiced her opinion to him. "I don't know. At this point, I'm really not sure. I've seen too much stuff that really shouldn't exist to discount anything at this point," she said. Chris nodded. That said a lot, and it really made him think about it too. Deep in the pit of his stomach, a void opened up that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with a small, gnawing fear that was starting to grow inside him. Had he signed up to something that he really should have thought twice about? He looked over to Caitlin again, and she smiled back at him. Well, there were some positives to coming on this little expedition as well, he supposed. "Are you okay? I didn't mean to worry you," she said. "I'm fine. That effigy was a little creepy, but it's probably nothing to worry about, hey?" "Probably. I was a little creeped out by it as well, and I didn't even get to really see it up close like you and Theodore did. It looked gross from what I could see, though," she said. "That was probably for the best. It's not the kind of thing you really want to see up close and personal. Well, maybe you can pop by my tent later and you can comfort me a little. How about that?" She smiled at him. Chris smiled back. "That sounds wonderful," he said. Chris unzipped the front of Caitlin's tent before pulling on his warm sweater again and smiled back at her. She was in her sleeping bag, but it didn't cover her entirely. She grinned back. "Shame you have to leave me so soon," she whispered. "Shame we have to be out here doing this when I could happily spend several days in a hotel room with you somewhere," he said. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Maybe once we're back." "That's a promise," he said. She made a happy little squeak, and her face lit up with a huge smile from ear to ear. "Sleep well," he said. "You too." He winked back at her, stepped out of the tent, and zipped it back up. The camp out here was empty, but the fire was still going, although it was getting a little low now. Chris picked up some of the wood they had collected earlier and stoked the fire, waiting for the new dry wood he had just added to catch as grey ash floated past him from the fire pit. He stood up and looked about him at the 4 tents that surrounded the fire. He and Kate had purposefully positioned theirs slightly away from the other 2, with hers being almost on the opposite side of the fire from Theodore's, in the hope that he wouldn't hear them making out in her tent. It seemed to have worked, and he could already hear the occasional snore from the old man's tent. Chris smiled and looked around him into the woods. They were miles away from any really large light sources, and you could really tell the difference out here. This was a kind of darkness you just didn't really get in England anymore. As he looked around, movement caught his eye, but it was difficult to make out with the light from the fire glaring near him. Chris moved around it and peered into the darkness, trying to make out any shapes he might recognize, when he suddenly saw a pair of eyes in the darkness staring back at him, almost glowing from the light of the fire. Chris stumbled back and fell to his bum as his feet caught on a root. He landed with a bump, with his eyes wide with fear and a sickness born of terror spreading through his gut. Chris found he could only stare as the eyes approached. The dark shape stepped into the very edge of the light, the flames of the newly stoked fire just catching the edges of the creature. Chris could just pick it out now and realized he was looking into the eyes of a wolf. Those yellow irises gleamed in the firelight as it stood there, staring at him, weighing him up, challenging him. An idea sprang into Chris's mind suddenly, and, without really thinking about it, he reached around and grabbed the end of one of the new logs he had just put into the fire. It had already caught alight on the other end, as he had hoped, so he pulled it out of the fire pit and turned to face the wolf. Chapter 4. It was gone. Where the wolf had once stood, there was now nothing, just empty air. Chris spun around and scanned the campsite, looking for the animal, wondering if it had really gone or if it might have just retreated, waiting for an opportunity to strike, but saw nothing. He was alone. It was about 20 minutes before Chris felt calm enough to return to his own tent. By then he had walked around the campsite twice, peering into the darkness, looking for the wolf, but he found nothing. He didn't sleep well for the rest of the night, waking up several times to look outside into the campsite, but he never saw the wolf again. When morning came, he was reluctant to get up, but pulled himself out of bed anyway. They had a long trek ahead of them, and they needed to keep going. Progress through the heavily wooded forest was slow-going for the most part. There were a few less dense areas where they could pick up the pace, but for a lot of it, they were wading through huge, overgrown areas of foliage or hacking their way through bushes. The terrain was rarely flat, either. As they headed up into the lower part of the mountain range, they were usually heading uphill, choosing their footing carefully to avoid tumbling back down a slope and impaling themselves on a branch. Chris found himself on more than one occasion basically getting down on all fours when the climb got too steep, grasping at roots and creepers to haul himself up the slope, and then reaching back to help Theodore and Caitlin up as well. The forest seemed to go on forever, and there were a few moments where Chris thought they were nearing the edge of the forest, only for it to close up around them once more. They did their best to keep on their current heading, using their compass to navigate and keep on a southerly course. If it weren't for the compass, though, they truly would have been lost a long time ago. But as the hours drew on, a part of Chris started to doubt the compass as well. They seemed to be no nearer the edge of the wood, and yet when he had seen the forest from a distance, and how it rose up the side of the mountain and eventually came to an end, he felt sure they would have come out the far end of it by now. He considered himself a good judge of distance, having fine-tuned it over years of hiking and mountaineering, and he'd guessed they would probably spend one night in the forest before they broke through to the far side today. When he next got the compass out, he gave it a tap and a shake, but it seemed to be working just fine, and they were still heading in the right direction. Maybe he'd misjudged it. Maybe the terrain was throwing him off. It was not the easiest forest he'd ever walked through. The guide seemed content, though, and continued to lead them through the wood, helping them pass some of the more challenging areas and pointing out anything they needed to be aware of. The air was getting cooler up here, and even with their continued movement and physical exertion, Chris could feel the cold seep through his hiking gear. Before too long, the air would also start to thin, making it harder for them to catch their breath. He hoped that Theodore would be okay when that started to kick in. They continued on, but Chris's unease about the forest and the terrain seemed to affect the other team members, as if, subconsciously, they were picking up on his doubts, and it wasn't long before Theodore expressed his own concern that they weren't out of the forest yet. The guide seemed the most confident out of them all, though, and muttered something about it being bigger than it looked. Chris didn't comment. He didn't want to worry anyone yet, and hoped he was just misjudging things. A short while later, as Chris neared the top of the next slope, he looked up to where the guide had been, hoping for a hand up, and found him nowhere to be seen. He'd disappeared. "What the? Where's he gotten to now?" he mumbled to himself, and proceeded to continue his climb, soon cresting the slope by himself and seeing Augustine a few meters away, looking at something at his feet. Chris stood and saw the body of a stag on the floor, along with a lot of blood. "Ugh," he muttered. It looked like it had been badly hurt by something. "Hey, a little help, please," Caitlin called up to him. Chris reached down and helped her up. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Looks like the guide found something," he said. "Oh," Kate asked, looking over. "Oh, geez, that's gross," she said in disgust on seeing the dead animal. Chris helped Theodore up before he walked over to Augustine and looked down at the eviscerated animal. Its belly had been slit open, spilling its insides all over the leaves and mud. But there was another wound on its throat as well, which was a little cleaner and easier to see, and it was this wound that concerned him. The throat had been cut cleanly with something sharp, a blade probably, which meant they really weren't out here alone. "That's disgusting," Caitlin said, still standing a few meters away and holding her nose. "Anything the matter?" Theodore asked, obviously realizing that Chris had noticed something amiss with it. For a moment, Chris considered keeping his diagnosis of the deer's cause of death to himself, but, on second thought, he reconsidered. He'd gain nothing by keeping it quiet, and they had just as much right to know something was wrong as he did. "This was killed with a blade, and recently too," he said. "A blade? You mean by a person?" Theodore asked. "That would be my guess, yes," Chris answered him. "I agree, and not long ago either," Augustine said. "We're not alone up here," Chris added. "The effigy and now this," Theodore said. "Someone's trying to scare us." "Well, it's working," Caitlin called to them. "Do you want to keep going?" Chris asked. "Of course. I have not come all this way to turn back now because of someone's sick joke." "No, we continue," Theodore said. "Okay, if you're sure. What about you, Caitlin? Are you still okay with all this?" "As long as I don't have to look at these things, yeah, I'm good," she said. "All right," Chris muttered. and gathered his things again as they set off once more. "Chris," Theodore said, coming to sit next to him later that night after they had made camp in the forest for the second night running. "Have you noticed that, well, this forest, it seems, that we should have been through to the other side by now?" "Yes, I've noticed," Chris answered. He glanced up. The guide was too far away to hear them, and Caitlin was in her tent already after their meal as the fire started to gutter and die. "What do you make of it?" Theodore asked. "Have we misjudged it?" "Honestly, I'm not sure. The terrain is very rough, and it's taking us longer to move even a short distance than I would have hoped. But I would have thought we'd have been out the other side by now. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. The guide doesn't seem too worried at this point," Chris answered. "True. Let's see what tomorrow brings, shall we?" Theodore said before he stood. "Good night, Chris," the old man said, gripping Chris's shoulder briefly as he passed by and walked towards his tent. "Night," Chris answered, and watched him go. If they weren't out of the forest by mid-morning tomorrow, then Chris felt justified in thinking that there really was something quite wrong about this. It should not take this long to traverse this forest. Chris finished his mug of tea and retired to his tent at roughly the same time as the guide, and went to lay on his bedroll, hoping he could sneak around to Caitlin's tent in a few minutes. The time passed slowly, and in the quiet as everyone settled down, the sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder. Every rustle of leaves and gust of wind sounded like another wolf, or something worse, creeping into the campsite, ready to rip through the tent and gut him where he slept. He wondered who it was who was creating these effigies, killing these stags, and leaving them for them to find. It felt like someone's sick joke rather than the work of a vengeful witch. As if someone was cashing in on the legends and doing their best to scare people away. Well, they might not be running back down the hill just yet, but it was certainly creeping him out. He'd slept in tents hundreds of times, in some of the most remote and desolate areas of the globe. And here he was in a European wood, feeling more scared than he'd ever felt before when camping. He was practically jumping off of his bedroll at each snap of a branch or crunch of leaves. Wait, that last sound. The crushing of some leaves. It sounded closer. There it was again. Crunch. A very distinctive noise, different from the natural sounds of the forest. Chris sat up, listening intently, waiting, and suddenly he heard it again, and again. They were footsteps. Someone was walking in the camp. Why was that freaking him out so much? It could be Caitlin coming over to see him, only he said he would come to her. Why would she be out now, walking in that strange, halting gait that the noises suggested? As he listened, the footsteps continued and receded, moving further away, much further than it would take to cross the campsite, and in the direction they were going, there were no more tents that way. His was the last one. The noise was disappearing into the woods. Chris couldn't resist it any longer. He had to see. He had to know. Unzipping the front of his tent, he parted the canvas but saw only darkness and the dying fire a short distance away. Slowly, he pushed his head through the opening and looked around him, mainly in the direction of the footsteps. As he peered into the night, his eyes adjusted and he could see someone, a woman, a naked woman, walking away into the woods. "Caitlin," he whispered. Chris looked over to the tent next to his and noticed the flap on the front was open. His eyes wide, Chris scrambled over and looked into Caitlin's tent. It was unoccupied. Caitlin was gone. "Shit," he muttered, and looked off in the direction she had gone, but couldn't see her. Chris picked up his LED torch from just inside his tent and ran into the night, sweeping the beam of light left and right. "Caitlin! Caitlin!" he called as he went, but saw nothing. He kept going, looking back over his shoulder from time to make sure he kept the campsite in view, something that was made a little easier due to a lamp that Theodore set up each night. As he moved through the trees, he tried to keep up a good pace, trying to catch Caitlin up, while also trying to be careful and not trip on one of the roots that stuck up from the earth. Suddenly, the ground fell away and sloped down into a depression, like a bowl that was somewhat clear of trees. Chris stopped at the edge, not wanting to go tumbling down there in the dark, but then suddenly spotted movement in the dim moonlight. Chris shone his torch, adjusting it for a more focused and narrow beam. It was Caitlin, but what was she doing? To his horror, he realized she wasn't alone. She threw her head back in ecstasy, revealing her face, but her eyes were completely white. Above her, golden yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, staring right at him. Chapter 5. "Hey, gorgeous," Caitlin said. Chris opened his eyes, rising from the fitful night's sleep he'd had on the floor of her tent. His body ached from the uneven ground, and he didn't feel very rested. "It's very cute of you, you know," she said. "Sorry, what?" he asked, wiping the gunk from his eyes. "You sleeping next to me all night. I'm sorry. I must have dozed off before you came over. These long days of hiking are taking their toll on me, I'm afraid," she said, smiling. Chris sat up. Had last night really happened? Had he really followed Caitlin off into the woods? Had he really found and saved her from that thing? It all felt so insane, like a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. Maybe he'd fallen asleep in his tent, and perhaps the stress of the day's hiking and the strange events during the day were freaking him out and causing some bad dreams. "Do you remember anything about last night?" "I'm not sure what happened, really," he said. "Other than a pretty freaky dream, I don't remember much at all," she said. "A dream?" he asked. "Nightmare, really. It's all a bit hazy now, but I just remember being in the woods, surrounded by wolves and—" She shivered then, her body reacting to some deep, dark, horrible feeling, maybe. "And what?" Chris asked. I don't know, I'm not sure. It's all just a blur, really," she said. Part of him wanted to tell her what he remembered, how he'd found her, and what was happening to her. But she moved over to him and wrapped her arms around him, and he found that he suddenly couldn't. It could wait. Once they were off this mountain, then he'd tell her. Then he'd be able to break it to her slowly and hopefully manage it all a little better. He wasn't sure it was the right choice, but there weren't many good choices open to him. Checking his watch, it was still really early, and he couldn't hear anyone else moving around outside. "I'm just going to get changed." He unzipped her tent, stepped out into the morning air, and found himself face to face with the severed head of the stag they had seen yesterday. He wasn't proud of the noise he made when he first saw it. The terrified yelp that left his lips sounded distinctly unmanly, and a pure, unadulterated expression of fear and surprise. Seconds later, his 3 campmates were out and staring at the thing with him. Someone had somehow driven a stake into the ground in their camp, right outside their tents, and then displayed the head of the stag on it. Flies buzzed about around it, crawling over the dripping wounds and the thing's bulging eyes. Chris wanted to be sick. "I ain't coming out till that thing is gone," Caitlin said, who had retreated back into her tent the moment she had seen it. "Well, I'd say this makes things personal," Theodore said. "Sorry?" Chris asked. The effigy and the dead stag could have been coincidences, things left there by chance that we just happened to run into. But this is different. Whoever did this came into our camp and left this here on purpose. They're trying to scare us, Theodore said. "You think?" Chris felt like Theodore was stating the obvious. "Well, it's working," Caitlin said. "But you are right. This is clearly personal now," Chris added. This was not a coincidence. "So, we go back now?" Augustine asked. Chris looked at Theodore. This was primarily his mission, so it was his call, and Caitlin's before his. "No, we've come too far. We go on," Theodore said. "Do you agree, Caitlin?" "Yeah, sure, just get that thing out of here," she barked. The day wore on with another endless trek through the forest, following the compass south, up the side of the mountain. The morning came and went without any sign of the woodland coming to an end. They stopped to eat and sat on some branches and logs, eating some of the food left over from last night and some of the provisions they had brought with them from the village. "Okay, I'm sure you've noticed, but I think something's wrong. We should have been out of the forest by now," Chris said. "I've been doing this kind of thing for a long time, and I know how long things take. This forest is big and the terrain is rough, but we're not that slow. Something is not right here and, well, frankly, I'm worried. I just wanted to know what you thought," he said to the group. He figured it was best to get this all out in the open and get people talking about it, rather than pretend everything was okay. "You know, I've noticed this too. I've already mentioned it to you, but personally I think we continue on. The fact that this is happening to me says we're close. Really close," Theodore said. "Close?" Augustine asked suspiciously. "Close to what?" Theodore sighed. "Okay, I'm not going to lie to you anymore. You were right. We're looking for the Wailing Tunnels." "I knew it," he yelled, and spat something in Romanian that Chris didn't understand, before standing up and walking a few meters away from the group, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "Caitlin?" Chris asked, letting Augustine have his moment of frustration and anger. "I figured as much, and I have to admit, it's got me worried too. I'm not sure if keeping going is the right thing to do," she said, her voice a little shaky. "But we're so close," Theodore pleaded. "I can feel it. We can find this." "But at what cost?" she asked. "We're clearly being threatened by someone. What's it going to take to get you to turn back?" "No one has been hurt," Theodore said. "Yet," Chris interjected. "Caitlin's right. This has gone too far. We need to go back before someone is really hurt." "You're giving up?" Theodore asked. "When someone sticks a severed animal head on a stake outside your tent one night, you don't ignore that," Chris said. To him, that stag head was a very direct and obvious warning that they should leave. Now ignoring it could mean they might just push whoever was doing these things a little too far, and no hidden cave was worth their lives. He'd expected more of a fight from Caitlin, thinking she would not want to give up, but when she supported his view, he felt more than a little surprised. Her support for him also seemed to take the wind out of Theodore's sails, and he didn't protest anywhere near as much as Chris had thought he would. Theodore sat back and considered Chris's comments before answering. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little worried," he admitted. "Do you want to die trying to do this?" Chris asked. "Well, of course not. I don't want anyone to get hurt." "Then I think this is the best course of action, and maybe we rethink this somewhat." "So we going back?" Augustine said, looking happier than he ever had on this whole trip. Chris sighed. Theodore surely knew he was right, even if admitting it was painful for him. But he picked up his things and didn't protest when they started to head back the way they had come. The temperature had started to drop some more, and about an hour into their walk down the mountain, the air started to get a little misty. They continued on, though, giving it no mind until the fog thickened enough that it was impossible to ignore. "Anyone think this is a little strange?" Chris asked. "The fog, you mean? Well, maybe. The clouds can close in around the mountains, though, so try not to worry too much," Theodore said. Chris pressed his lips together in consternation, but continued forward, following the map and the compass, dodging around the trees as they appeared through the mist. He nearly bumped into one while he was distracted by the map, and pushed the branch away as it nearly poked him in the eye, only to feel a wet, sticky goo on his fingers. He stepped back and looked at his hand in disgust and noticed it was a black slime-like substance rather than the tree sap he had expected. "What the?" he said, and looked up at the tree, which was clearly dead. It looked skeletal with its bare branches and nearly black bark. "What's up?" Caitlin asked from nearby. I don't know. Maybe nothing. It's just this tree. It's a bit gross, really," he said. "Looks like there's a few of them," Caitlin answered him. Chris looked around and noticed there were several trees like this now, all around him. Not a living leaf in sight on any of them, just blackened claws reaching for the sky. "Where the hell are we?" Chris muttered to himself. "Hey, Augustine, do you recognize this area?" Augustine was taking a closer look at another of the nearby trees. No, I don't. Sorry. I've never been here before." Theodore stepped forward. "Let's keep going, shall we?" "Yeah, this is weird," Caitlin agreed. Chris moved away from the tree and continued on, walking into the mist and pulled out his compass once again. He looked at it and did a double take, looking back up and then back down again. He was sure it had been pointing in the other direction a moment ago. He slowed and turned, only for the compass needle to swing and point in another direction. "Huh?" Chris said, as he turned again, only to watch the needle swing wildly around for a second time. Chris gave the thing a shake and then looked again. Now it was worse. The needle didn't even attempt to stay still. It just swung about, this way and that. Guys," Chris called out. "We have a problem." Theodore glanced back. "What is it now?" "The compass isn't working," Chris stated. "It's just swinging around like crazy. I can't get a reading from it at all." Immediately, everyone got their own compasses out and checked them. "What the hell?" Caitlin exclaimed. Theodore grunted. "This is worrying." "It is no matter," Augustine added. "North is this way. We keep north, we get down the mountain." "Sure, why not?" Chris said, stuffing the compass in his pocket. "It's not like we have many other options." "You trust me, yes?" their guide asked. "Yeah," Chris agreed, finding it amusing that the guide seemed happier now, when they would be relying on him that much more than at any time previous to this during their trek. They continued on through the dead black trees and mist, trying to keep a fairly straight line when something large and dark loomed out of the fog, its shape becoming clearer as they approached. It was a building of some kind, and it looked like it had seen better days. Made from wood and brick, it had clearly been left abandoned for a while, but it wasn't alone. As they neared this one, the mist seemed to draw back, and more ominous black buildings faded into view, all of them derelict and at a certain level of decay. "Is this a village?" Chris asked Augustine. "Do you know where we are?" Chris looked over when no answer was forthcoming to see Augustine looking confused and worried. "Augustine!" Chris called out again. He looked over and then around him once more before looking back. I don't know. There's no village up here. This shouldn't be here as far as I know, and I've lived here for decades." Chris didn't answer him. He just took a deep breath and continued on, passing the first few buildings, peering into the dark windows, half expecting to see someone or something looking back at him. Chris wandered down what appeared to be a road with the buildings on either side. He found it a little difficult to keep his bearings in here. But, before long, the road wound through and into a village square with buildings all around them. Chris noticed a well in the center of the square and walked over to it. Just like everything else, it looked old and about ready to collapse. He leaned over and looked down the well, but saw nothing but darkness. He turned and looked around him at the shadowy houses and other buildings that surrounded them. The square was small, just a few buildings wide on each side, haphazardly placed and lacking any real sense of planning. "It looks deserted," Caitlin commented. "I have no idea if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Christ, this place freaks me out. What if our crazy stalker lives in here somewhere?" Chris said. "I don't think we can start to make any assumptions at this point, but I think we need to keep going," Theodore said, looking more scared now than he had done before. "I agree. We should leave," the guide said. "Sure, what time is it?" Chris asked. "Late afternoon, I think." Theodore pulled his sleeve back. It seems time really does fly. It's early evening. We should be making camp," he said. "Makes sense. I'm feeling a little hungry," Caitlin stated. "Let's move out of the square, but maybe we can find a house we can set up in. We could have a roof over our heads this time," Chris said. "You think that's a good idea?" Theodore asked. "We'd be less visible and drier," Chris answered. Part of him, a small part, gave him a niggling feeling of doubt about staying in the village, but the hiker in him knew it to be the best option. As long as the building appeared to be basically safe and not about to fall down, it would provide an extra layer of protection against the elements and hide them from trouble. It was the logical choice. But not much about this trip seemed in any way logical. Everything seemed almost dreamlike, not quite real. But these dreams weren't happy ones. They were creepy landscapes of ever-growing dread that clawed at your brain. A large part of him wanted to run, to just sprint into the mist and get away from the crawling terror that seemed to be sneaking up on him, about to overwhelm him and drown him in fear. "Well, okay, sure. It makes sense. Let's keep going then, and find somewhere on the way out of here and set up camp," Theodore said. Chris led the group north, or what he hoped was north, heading down the mountainside, leaving the village square behind and walking along what he could only guess was perhaps a road leading out of town. The whole village had not been used in years, though, and the streets must have once been overgrown with bushes and young trees until whatever had killed everything in the area had hit. They were a good way down the street when Chris decided to check out one of these buildings and move towards one of the less derelict ones. Like everywhere else here, the house looked somewhat burnt out. Its once wooden walls were blackened and brittle. The front door was not attached to the frame, but on the floor, rotting away and covered in decomposing lichen and moss. There was a dark hallway ahead of him and unsafe-looking stairs leading up and rooms off the hallway. Chris stepped forward into the building with the team watching from outside. A floorboard creaked underfoot as he put his weight on it. He discounted the stairs right away. There was a much bigger chance of the floor giving way and someone getting seriously hurt up there. The building was silent. The air didn't move and everything was still. Turning right through a doorway, the room in here was easily big enough for them all. Some of the shutters on the windows were still intact, and the floor seemed stable enough. "Come through," he called out to his team. Seconds later, Theodore, Caitlin, and Augustine walked slowly into the room. "What do you think?" "There's enough room for all of us," he said. "Have you seen the rest of the house?" Caitlin inquired. "No, but I'd suggest we don't go looking around, especially not upstairs. I don't want anyone hurting themselves," Chris answered her. Caitlin looked up at the ceiling. "Good point," she said. "Let's set up. We should still be able to pitch our tents in here if you like. The wood's damp and soft enough, I think." Before long, they were all settled down, having cleared away some of the detritus in here and set up their tents or bedrolls on the damp floorboards. They'd lit a small fire in the stone fireplace where Augustine had worked his usual wonders with the food they still had left. They would need to get off the mountain due to lack of provisions in a day or two anyway. The village was quiet. Really quiet. After having gotten used to the noises of the forest, with its rustling leaves and creatures going about their lives, the dead silence of this place felt eerie and much more worrying. Before long, they were all tucked into their sleeping bags and drifting off into a fitful sleep. He didn't feel like he'd been asleep for longer than 5 minutes when something woke him. Chris looked around, wondering what it was, only to see Augustine standing in the doorway to the hall looking at him. Augustine raised a finger to his lips, indicating that he should be quiet before he turned and walked away, out of sight towards the front door. "What? Augustine, wait. Where are you going?" Chris said as he sat up, wiping his eyes. "Hey, Caitlin, wake up," he said to her where she lay, her head just visible inside her sleeping bag. But she didn't react. Chris pulled himself out of his sleeping bag and pulled on his shoes. "Caitlin, Kate, are you in there? Wake up," he called, and grabbed her shoulder, trying to shake her awake. But she didn't. "Theodore," Chris called. He laid on his bedroll closer to Chris than Augustine had been, but he also seemed oblivious to Chris's attempts to wake him. He spent a few more seconds trying to wake his two companions with no success before he knew he needed to go after Augustine, lest he lose him in the mist and darkness. Cursing, Chris grabbed his torch and moved outside into the mist, which had thickened up again, and looked around him. Was that Augustine? He thought as he saw a shadow in the fog move. Stepping out into the street, he felt quite sure he could find his way back, and moved to follow the figure he'd just seen. The mist ebbed and flowed, growing thicker, and then fading away in patches, allowing Chris glimpses of the figure moving ahead of him. Chris kept going, jogging forward and calling out the guide's name, trying to get him to stop, without running too fast himself and not being able to react in time to something appearing from the mist. The street widened out suddenly, and ahead, through the mists, Chris could make out the well in the middle of the square, standing as a dark grey silhouette against the lighter grey atmosphere. But there was something else there as well. Someone else. A figure stood next to the small monument. Augustine, maybe. Chapter 6. Chris moved forward quietly, not wanting to spook Augustine. He wanted to get closer before he called his name, but as he moved closer, something about the shape of this person seemed wrong, and it soon became clear that this was not their guide. This was someone else. It was a woman. Chris frowned and shivered. Something felt deeply wrong here as he watched her sit on the edge of the well, seemingly oblivious to him. He knew he shouldn't stay. Every logical bone in his body screamed for him to turn around and leave this place, but his innate curiosity about the world, that was a big reason for his mountain adventures so far, wouldn't allow it. The need to know, the need to see more, to see what was over that hill and up that mountain drove him forward. He walked forward, hearing her for the first time. She was crying, softly, gently, but undeniably. Who was this woman? Chris stepped closer, the mist between them thinning, revealing the rags she wore, ripped to shreds and stained brown from mud and who knew what else. The scraps of clothing she wore almost blended into her grim, mottled skin. She seemed to be covered in bruises and varicose veins, while boils bubbling up through red raw skin could be seen here and there, with some of the bulging pustules already burst, leaking yellow juices over her dirty skin. As he watched, he felt sure he saw something move under the skin of her thigh. His stomach sank, and he nearly lost his evening meal, catching the need to vomit seconds before it overcame him. But still, she ignored him and continued to cry. Composing himself, Chris coughed to announce his presence to her. Hey, are you okay? You don't look well, he said. He was only maybe 2 or 3 meters away from her now, and she suddenly stopped crying, and everything grew still and silent, as if the whole village had heard him and had stopped to listen. He was imagining things. It was already quiet, he told himself, not wanting to freak out over something he must have imagined. The woman slowly turned her head and looked at him from under wet, dirty hair that hadn't seen a comb in weeks or months. More bulging pustules that looked thin and ready to burst covered her left cheek, while brackish black saliva leaked from the corner of her mouth. Her dark eyes locked onto his, staring at him, as if angry for the interruption. "Ah, hi, are you all right? Can I help you at all?" She stared at him, unmoving, as if weighing him up, judging him before answering. As he watched, something definitely moved under the skin of her cheek, crawling over her muscles, just beneath her skin. "Look, we can help you. I think you need to see a doctor," he said. In less than a second, she was on him. She moved so quickly, like an animal, pouncing on him and throwing him to the floor. He hit the muddy ground with a thud, the wind knocked out of him for a second, leaving him gasping for breath. The woman convulsed. Her whole body shuddered as her breathing became ragged and halting. Catching his breath finally, Chris took a big gulp of air, feeling the life-giving oxygen filling his lungs as the woman heaved and then threw up on him. Black slime vomited from her mouth onto Chris. He turned from her, doing his best to cover his face to keep from ingesting any of it. Something was in the slime, he realized, as he felt small, solid but lightweight stuff hitting him along with the black goo. Chris flailed, having lost all composure as he swung his arms about, kicking his legs in blind panic. The fear and disgust was visceral, primal, and came from a part of him he didn't know he had. He just wanted to get away and would do anything to achieve that. He suddenly noticed something tickle him, something moving lightly over his skin. He yelped. The noise he made was utterly involuntary and came from a place of pure fear. He glanced at his black, slime-covered arms and saw things, insects, crawling on him in the goo. They were huge and running all over him. He could feel them under his clothes and in his hair, skittering about as his attacker vomited more at him. Just as suddenly as she had attacked, the insect woman was knocked off him, sent flying onto the ground next to him, and coming to rest against the side of the well as he saw Caitlin lower her leg. She'd kicked the infected woman off him with an impressive display of strength. Chris sat up, madly brushing the insects off of him. He found a couple of them trying to eat into him, to get under his skin, but he pulled them off and threw them away. Caitlin helped, pulling his shirt off and then using it to knock them off and wipe away the slime. Chris looked over at the woman who had attacked him. She'd sat up, putting her back against the well as her body continued to convulse until it bulged at her abdomen and then burst, with more black slime and crawling insects covering the ground around her. Chris backed off. She was clearly dead. Her whole belly below her ribcage was pretty much gone. "What the holy fuck was that?" Chris asked. "I have no idea, and I do not want to stay here a moment longer than we have to," Caitlin answered him. Chris looked at her. "I couldn't wake you." "Wake me? I heard wailing out in the village. It woke me up, and you and Augustine were gone. I came running and found you and that thing," she said. "Theodore, is he okay?" "Sleeping soundly by the looks of things," she said. "We need to find Augustine. We can't leave here without him," Chris stated. "Any ideas where he is?" "I don't know," Chris said. "I was following him through the mist, but only ended up finding her." He pointed to the dead woman. "Right, okay. Let's have a scan around, see if we can spot him," she said, and made to move off into the mist. "Okay, let's do it," Chris said, and followed her, glancing back at the insect woman for one last time before the mist obscured his view. Chris followed Caitlin around the square, going down some of the roads that led off from it, until, as they neared the road that led back to the house they had stayed within, he spotted two shadows within the mist ahead. "Hey, stop," he whispered, taking her arm in his hand to stop Caitlin, and then pointed forward. "Is that—" She answered him in equally hushed tones. "Let's see," he said, spotting a destroyed cart rotting away in the square a little closer to the two shadows. He moved forward, making for the cover of the cart. The shadows grew more distinct as they approached, and it was clear by the time they had reached the cart that one of them was Augustin. "It's him," Chris muttered, and made to stand and call out. He'd been worried that it could have been another nightmare in human form, like the woman at the well, so keeping hidden had made sense. But this was Augustin, their guide. "Yeah, but who the hell is that?" Caitlin asked, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. The other figure was approaching Augustin, who looked fascinated by whoever it was. "Why are we whispering? He might need our help," Chris asked. "I don't know. Something isn't right here," Caitlin said. "You're damn right," Chris said, and pulled away from her. "Augustin!" he called out to their guide. Augustin stopped and looked over, as did the other figure, who appeared to be wearing a hooded cloak, obscuring their features, but, if he had to guess, their shape betrayed a feminine form. The figure in the cloak seemed to watch Chris for a moment. "Chris, is that you?" Augustin said. "Where am I? What? Who is this?" he asked, looking at the figure. There was a flash of movement as a black blur shot out at Augustin from the cloaked figure, making the rags of the dirty-looking cape flap about. "Ugh!" grunted Augustin, suddenly hugging his stomach as the cloaked figure flickered into the air as little more than a blurred after-image, and was gone. Chris didn't know what to think, but felt suddenly ill when he noticed the blood pour over Augustin's arms, followed by ropey intestines bubbling out from inside of him. "Oh, God!" Caitlin gasped, giving voice to the shock that he himself was feeling as he watched Augustin drop to his knees. Moments later, he pitched sideways and hit the floor, dead. Chris just stood there, not really knowing what to do or how to react. His world was swiftly turning upside down, and the shock of what he was seeing felt like it might overwhelm him and drag him into a madness from which there was no escape. "Hey," said Caitlin. She was right next to him and had grabbed his arm, shaking it as she called to him. "Huh? What?" he said, snapping out of the trance he'd fallen into and looking down at her, away from the gutted guide. "Snap out of it," she hissed. "I can't lose you here, not now. We need you. We have to get out of here." The situation they were in, the very real danger of it, was thrown into sharp relief suddenly. Some stranger, maybe the person who had been terrorizing them this whole time, had just killed one of their group. There was no saving Augustin, but he could help save Caitlin and Theodore. He could get them off the mountain and save their lives. "Right. Yes. Okay, let's go," he stated. "I think we have to leave Augustin here. There's nothing more we can do for him." "Okay, if you think that's best," Caitlin replied, looking somewhat upset. "I hope Theodore is safe." "Me too," Chris agreed, as they ran out towards the edge of the village and into the house they had camped in. Sure enough, there he was, sleeping soundly. "Wake him up, I'll grab our things," Chris said, and started to throw things into his backpack and pack up their camping equipment, while Caitlin woke Theodore up. "What? What's the matter? What's going on?" Theodore said, sitting up. "Someone killed Augustin. We have to leave now," she hissed at him. It took a moment to get Theodore to understand the urgency of their situation, but as he came around, he quickly agreed with them. As they gathered their things, they did their best to relate their experiences out in the village to him, which served to make Theodore pack even faster. 10 minutes later, they were out of the house and moving at a brisk walk away from the village, through more of those creepy dead trees. It felt like they were being watched, and the nagging fear that something would leap out or creep up behind them drove them forward. Chris found himself looking left and right and constantly checking behind him for the next creature to come hunting for them. Caitlin and Theodore were doing the same, clearly as nervous and afraid as he was. As they walked, he noticed that the ground was becoming more and more uneven and rocky as they moved up and down slopes, and soon found themselves navigating through a dip with steep rocky cliffs, maybe 4 or 5 meters high on either side of them. The going was slow, but the mist was starting to fade, and Chris no longer felt in immediate danger. "I think we're still quite high up," he said, calling to Caitlin and Theodore behind him. "It looks that way," Theodore answered. As they struggled on through the early morning, the light growing by the minute, the rough cut in the rock they were navigating through seemed to become more regular and the ground flatter, until it was as if this pass had been deliberately cut into the rock. And then, suddenly, it opened up as they found themselves on the edge of a sheer cliff, hundreds of feet above anything else, and just a narrow ledge leading off to their right along the cliff face. Below them, clouds obscured their view, with only peaks of rock jutting through the grey mist, creating a surreal landscape and making it impossible to know where they really were. Looking again, trying to figure out which part of the Transylvanian mountains they were in, Chris just couldn't see anything he recognized. If he didn't know better, he'd say they were in another part of the world entirely. It was probably the fear talking, though, and maybe once the clouds cleared, he'd start to recognize where they were. Chris turned to his two companions. "Looks like there's only one way forward," he said, "unless you fancy going back the way we came." "I'm not walking through that village again," Caitlin said. Theodore looked along the ledge, apparently deep in thought, before turning back to them. "I think we're close, you know." "Close?" Chris asked. "To what?" Caitlin looked around her and then along the ledge. "You know what? I think you're right. We might find the caves after all." "You're kidding, right? You want to head into a haunted cave after what we just went through?" "We knew this wouldn't be easy," Caitlin explained. "Come on, let's see where this goes," Theodore agreed, his voice excited suddenly. "Look, I'm leading the way. It's the only way forward anyway," Chris ordered them, feeling frustrated that after all that had just happened, they wanted to walk right back into the lion's den. He made for the ledge and started to move along it. It was less than a meter wide and often quite thin in places, or sloped, but Chris took his time and they made good progress. About an hour into it, as they rounded another bend, the ledge moved into a valley, the bottom of it still hidden beneath clouds, but opposite them another cliff face rose up, and as they moved into the valley, Chris spotted a rope bridge off in the distance. "We're coming up on something," he said, pointing it out to his teammates, who started to get excited by it. Chris shook his head, bemused by their stupidity, and focused on what he was doing, putting one step in front of the other and ignoring the rope bridge ahead. Behind him, Theodore chatted excitedly with Caitlin, asking her for details of what she knew and offering his own ideas about what this might be. They continued on until Theodore called out to him. "What do you make of that?" he asked. Chris glanced back to him and then followed his pointed finger, looking ahead to where the rope bridge reached the opposite side. He could quite clearly see that a huge face had been carved into the opposite cliff face. It was carved to look like its mouth was open wide, shouting or wailing, with the rope bridge disappearing inside the darkness of its mouth. The look of it started to bring back that creeping fear he'd felt on walking into the misty village, and he felt sure that nothing good would come of going in there. But he knew that his two companions would insist on it, and he couldn't let them do it alone. As they neared the rope bridge, the ledge widened out, making the going much easier. But still there was only one way forward as the ledge stopped at the bridge. Theodore and Caitlin sounded giddy with excitement, but the mountaineer side of him wouldn't let these two inexperienced climbers run about up here unsupervised, and he knew they would want to cross that bridge. Standing directly in front of the huge carved face, its mouth open wide as if in pain, he could feel the dread within him growing, threatening his very sanity. You want to go in there, don't you? He stated. Theodore nodded. It's what we came here for, so, yes, I do. Yeah, I do too, Caitlin agreed. This is what this trip was all about. Okay, sure, Chris agreed. But we do this carefully and professionally, and you listen to me and follow my directions, okay? They both nodded, smiling and clearly excited. Made mainly out of rope, the bridge had wooden planks as a base to walk on, but they all looked rotten and old. Chris went first, telling his two teammates to hold onto the ropes of the bridge with both hands after using a rope to connect them to each other. Stepping cautiously out onto the wood of the bridge, Chris directed his two teammates to follow his steps and put their feet only where he put his, as they took it one step at a time. They were halfway over when Chris heard a faint snapping noise from behind them. He looked back and heard it again, spotting a poof of rope fibers blossom into the air. He'd thought he couldn't feel any worse than he already did, but that was quickly proven wrong by the immediate intense fear of falling to his death if this bridge collapsed, and it was looking like it might actually do that now. Chapter 7. For a brief moment, Chris looked down through the gaps in the wooden slats and into the grey void filled with clouds and felt utterly terrified. It took all his focus and determination to pull his eyes away from the drop beneath him, but somehow he managed it and fixed his eyes forward, focusing on the goal of crossing this damn bridge. He kept moving, doing his best to pick up the pace without worrying anyone too much. He chose not to spread any panic by telling them of what he had just seen back from where they had come. If they knew the bridge might be about to fall, the fear might make them put their feet in the wrong place, and then they'd be falling for no good reason at all. Besides, it might not snap, he thought, looking at the rope in his left hand. He moved cautiously, putting one foot in front of the other, focusing on the darkness of the mouth and the ledge he could now see within it. If he could just reach that far side, he'd be able to hold on to something should the bridge fall and keep the others from dropping. The wooden planks strained the ropes as he shifted his weight onto them, making them creak and crack as he moved. Concentrating on each step, one at a time, he pressed on, keeping at least one hand on the ropes with as firm a grip as he could manage. Time seemed to slow down as the far ledge grew closer and closer, taunting him with how near it was, and yet how far. The last few planks of wood passed beneath his feet, and finally he was there, on dry rocks and safe. He turned to watch the other two and smiled as Caitlin made it. She was soon followed by Theodore, who was breathing hard. "Well done," Chris complimented them. "Christ, I thought that bridge was done for." "That was intense," Theodore commented. "We're here. We're actually here," Caitlin gasped in wonder, ignoring the banter. Chris looked around. "So this is the Wailing Tunnels." As if in answer, a gust of wind whipped past the entrance, creating a howling sound as it passed the cave entrance that was incredibly eerie. "It is, yes, and that noise is apparently why it's named so," Caitlin explained. "Others say the name came from the sounds of the witch's victims," Theodore added, wailing in the tunnels as she tortured and killed them. "So, a cheery place then?" Chris said sarcastically. Caitlin smiled, but didn't answer. "Not really," Theodore replied. Chris shook his head for a moment, bemused that Theodore didn't get the sarcasm. "So, what's the plan? Shall we have a look around?" he asked. Theodore had already removed his backpack and was hunting around inside it. He pulled out some flares and started to light his lamp. "Most certainly. Once I'm ready," Theodore said, finally shouldering his pack and pulling out a notebook and camera. Caitlin also pulled out a lantern, something a little more modern than Theodore's gas one. Caitlin's was a bright LED affair, battery-powered that could be charged up during the day with its solar panels. She also pulled out a torch and started to sweep it around the tunnel. Chris's own equipment mimicked Caitlin's, so he followed her lead in turning on his own lamp and torch. The tunnel was rough-hewn, but well worn on the ground to an almost smooth path. There wasn't much decoration in here, apart from the walls seemed to have been dyed a deep red in a patchy fashion. Chris didn't like to think what had caused that to happen. Chris stayed at the rear and let the other two lead the way, but kept close to them and watched for obstacles and dangers. Apart from a few animal bones, some bits of rag, and a few sticks here and there, the tunnel was bare as it wound into the mountain, twisting left and right as it went. After a couple of minutes of gingerly walking through the tunnel, they turned into another straight section and saw that it looked like the tunnel opened into a room up ahead. They moved forward and peered into the darkness. Chris could make out something in the room, some kind of furniture, maybe, or decoration. He wasn't sure. They moved slowly forward and reached the end of the tunnel, where, sure enough, it opened up into a wide, circular room with maybe 6 or 7 corridors leading off from it. In the center, the stone from the ground rose up into a 6-foot oblong, creating a table or altar. This stone edifice had also been stained red, and it was quite clear to Chris what had caused that. Unlit candles with melted runnels of wax running down them sat on the edges of the stone block, along with knives, a skull, small glass bottles, plant cuttings, effigies, a goblet, and other less identifiable bits of organic matter. Rags hung from the walls, old wooden tables sat around the edges of the room with piles of thick leather tomes on them, ink bottles and dip pens, more bottles and vials, bulbous glass bottles, more candles, and lots more bits that cluttered the tabletops. If he'd ever sat and tried to think what a witch's hovel might look like inside, this seemed to fit pretty closely. Seeing this in this modern digital age was even freakier, to be honest. Rational thought and science had banished thoughts of magic to the shadows, and yet here in the mountains, it seemed to be alive and well. Moving into the room, Chris started to move around it, fascinated as he scanned over the tables with his torch, pausing to flick through the pages of an open book filled with a strange text he couldn't read and curious little drawings of blasphemous imagery. "Theodore?" he heard Caitlin say, and he turned around. Caitlin was at a nearby table doing the same thing he had been, but Theodore had disappeared and seemed to be no longer in the room. "Where is he?" she asked. "I've no idea. Theodore," Chris called, but heard nothing. Chris walked around the room, checking he wasn't behind anything or otherwise hidden, before he called again, louder this time. "Theodore!" "Chris!" It was Theodore's voice, and it echoed through the room, but it wasn't loud. He sounded far away, lost in the tunnel somewhere. Chris kept calling, getting Theodore to call back as he walked around the room listening at each tunnel. "Where are you?" Chris shouted. "I don't know. In the tunnels somewhere. I didn't go far. We're still in the room, you know. Can you follow our voices?" Chris asked. He turned to Caitlin. "He sounds like he's down this one," he said. She was standing by another cave entrance. "He sounds like he's down here, to me," she replied. Chris frowned and looked at a nearby tunnel. "Hang on," he said, and walked to another tunnel. "Theodore?" he called. "Yes?" Theodore answered. The voice sounded like it came from this tunnel too. "Crap," he muttered. "He could be down any of them. It must be like some kind of maze in there," he said to Caitlin. "Theodore, keep talking. I'll try to find you." "Okay, Theodore started to sing some kind of local Romanian song that sounded quite out of tune coming from him, but he didn't care. It was noise that he could follow. "Okay, great. Keep singing," he called to Theodore. "I'm checking the tunnels," he said to Caitlin as he moved around the room, focusing on the noise and listening at each tunnel in turn around the room, trying to find the one Theodore seemed closest to. He circled the entire room. "Did you have any luck?" he said to Caitlin as he considered the tunnels. He felt he knew which ones Theodore sounded loudest in, but there wasn't much in it. "Caitlin," he said again, realizing she'd not answered. He looked around the room, but she was nowhere to be seen. He was alone. "Caitlin! Caitlin!" he called, but heard nothing. Theodore's singing stopped. "Theodore? Are you still there?" Chris called out, but again he heard nothing but silence. "Theodore? Caitlin? Can you hear me? Shout if you can hear me. I can't hear you. Where did you go?" His voice echoed around the room and down the tunnels, but he couldn't hear anything in return. Looking around him again, he suddenly realized he had no idea which tunnel led out of here. They all looked the same, and he hadn't thought to mark the tunnel they had entered through. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline coursed through his body. He felt dizzy and confused. He had no idea what to do or how to escape this place. He didn't want to leave alone, though, if he could even get out of the tunnels at all. He put his hands on the altar and leant against it. The silence of the caves was almost deafening. Did he just hear something faint in the distance, far off in the tunnels? He moved over to the side of the room and towards one of the entrances to the cave system, and felt sure he could hear something. A voice, maybe. It was far off or faint, one of the two. He looked back at the room. A niggling doubt in the back of his mind picked at his brain, but he discounted it and turned to face down the tunnel and the darkness within. "Hello?" he said. "Caitlin? Theodore? Was that you?" He followed the tunnel around a corner and it split in two. He listened down each, chose the right-hand branch, and moved along it. A short distance ahead, he found a crossroads as two tunnels intersected. Which way? He thought. An idea occurred to him suddenly. He should mark the way he'd come so he could follow it back, like breadcrumbs. But why had that only just occurred to him now? He reached into his backpack and pulled out a stale granola bar and tore part of it off and placed it on the floor, just inside the tunnel he'd reached the crossroads from, and turned left. He didn't go far before the sound he'd been following faded away. Must be the other way, he thought, and made his way back to the crossroad. He looked down to where he'd put his marker, but it wasn't there. But then he noticed it in the opposite tunnel. "What? What the hell?" he said. Which way was back? He ignored the marker and went back the way he'd come, and instead of the corridor being joined by another, he found himself at another crossroads. This wasn't right. Had he turned around somehow? He turned back, heading back to the crossroads, only to find it was a T-junction. "Huh?" he grunted. The tunnels were changing, moving about around him, getting him lost. His heart rate rose again as the fear and panic grew. He needed to get out of here. A deep, guttural scream crashed over him, echoing through the tunnels. It sounded male and desperate. Was it Theodore? "Theodore, run! Whatever it is, get out of there!" he shouted, but the screaming continued, oblivious, becoming high-pitched and blood-curdling, followed by ragged panting and the sounds of someone facing a very painful death. Chris couldn't handle it anymore. This was too much, so he picked a direction, giving it no thought at all, and ran, sprinting down the tunnel, taking the corners at speed, not knowing if he was getting anywhere nearer to the noise. The screaming stopped, and the tunnels fell silent. Chris reached a crossroads again and looked down each tunnel, seeing only darkness. He spun around, listening, trying to hear anything or spot any clue, only to look down the tunnel to his left for the third time and see the room at the end of it, glowing with a flickering golden yellow, suggesting candlelight. Chris stared down the tunnel and, without really thinking about it, started to walk down there, slowly. The room grew closer, but the tunnel was at an angle to the room, not giving him a good view at all. Funny thing was, he couldn't remember any of the tunnels leading off from the room in this way. Closing in on the entrance to the room, He could hear movement, the sound of tearing, rending, and something wet and soft against the stone. What was that? He thought, as he reached the entrance to the room and got a good look inside. It was the same room, except all the candles were lit, and upon the altar, a blood-splattered body was laid out on its back with someone, a woman with long hair, drenched in sticky, glistening blood, crouched over the top of it. She was turned away from Chris, with a huge knife in one hand, slicing the body open and pulling at its insides with the other. He looked at the body's shoes and realized he knew them. They were Theodore's shoes. His breath caught in his throat and he gasped, realizing that his friend was dead and the screams he'd heard were his. The killer stopped moving on hearing the gasp and slowly turned. Looking out at him through hair that had been caked in blood was Caitlin. She smiled. "Caitlin," Chris said, his voice filled with fear, causing it to shake. "What? I don't understand. What have you done?" "What's so difficult to understand?" she asked. "You've killed—" "Yes, I've killed the nosy little shit. What of it?" "But I thought—" "What the hell's going on here?" he asked, as Caitlin lifted the dagger and licked the blood off the blade in a long, languid movement. The blade was huge and curved. He'd seen them before. Were they what the Gurkhas used? He wasn't sure. His mind wasn't thinking straight. Chris recoiled in fear and revulsion as she pulled her blood-covered tongue back into her mouth and swallowed. Movement to the sides caught his attention, and he saw two wolves sitting there, watching him from the shadows, their yellow eyes gleaming. "What the hell is this? Who are you?" he asked. "Isn't it obvious?" she asked, standing up on the altar and turning to face him. Her clothes started to disintegrate and flow off her body, turning into mist that encircled her and turned slowly black before coating her body in a skin-tight, slightly shiny covering, similar to a catsuit, while some of the dark mist continued to encircle her. You're the witch... You're Yasamen? The witch?" he stammered, struggling to get it out, still feeling slightly ridiculous saying it. "Well, it's just Yasmin now," she smiled, and floated slowly down off the altar to the floor. That was enough for Chris, and he turned to run as terror flooded his system. He'd run into the tunnels, lose her in there and try to find his way out somehow, he thought. But he was brought up short as he turned and found himself facing the cloaked figure that had gutted Augustine in the village. This close up in the candle light, he could see the pale, angular face beneath the ragged hood with its alien almond-shaped eyes, strange symmetrical scars, and wicked smile. "Shit!" he yelped and stumbled to the floor in shock. "And that's Kez," the woman in black said from behind him. He looked back and saw Caitlin, or Yasmin, whoever it was, casually walk over to him, flipping the blade for a better grip. "Why do this? What was all this for? I don't understand," he said, as Yasmin crouched down next to him, balancing on the balls of her feet. "Ultimately, it was a bit of fun. Theodore has been hunting for me for decades. We'd met before, not that he ever realized, and I followed his work, feeding him bits of information, leading him on, teasing him. You know. He was getting older, and well, I thought it might be fun to lead him up here. Unfortunately for you, he invited you up here as well," she said. That, he said, pointing to Theodore's dead body, "was for fun. When you've lived as long as I have, you need to find ways to fill your time, young man. You, for instance, provided me with some entertainment," she said. "Your face when you found me in the woods was a picture," she smiled. "You did that?" he asked, knowing the answer. "Don't be dim," she chastised him. "So you're a... what? A witch?" he asked. "A Magi, technically, but yes, one of many in this world," she said, sighing and standing up. What's going on?" Chris asked, sensing that Yasmin seemed to be getting bored of their talk and feeling terrified by what she might do next. "Well, It's been fun, but I have stuff to do, so if it's all the same, she said, and swung her blade down onto the top of his head. There was a brief, intense flare of pain on the crown of his head before nothing.
Kez watched as her master slammed the point of her kukri dagger down onto the top of this mortal's head. The whole foot-long blade went straight into his brain pan, causing him to spasm before falling limp, held sitting up only by Yasmin's grip on her dagger. She jerked it out, spraying blood that just missed Kez, and let the body fall. "Well, that was fun," Kez said. Yasmin looked at her and raised one eyebrow. Kez bowed her head in deference to her master and mentor, knowing the comment was a little too sarcastic for Yasmin's liking. With this little distraction out of the way, it would be back to the main business at hand of hunting for the Libre Nox Noctis, the Book of Night, and finding it before the Arcadians did. Magic flared around Yasmin and enveloped them both, teleporting them from the wailing tunnels. They had work to do.
The end. This has been Pilgrimage, a Magi Saga story, by Andrew Dobell. You can find out more about the Magi Saga and the author's other stories by going to his website at andrewdobellauthor.com.